The dress had been my armor for so long that I almost forgot what I was hiding underneath it. I smoothed the fabric over my forearms out of habit, a gesture so practiced it had become invisible, like blinking or breathing. 3 years of waitressing at Aurelia, one of Manhattan's most exclusive private dining clubs, had turned that motion into instinct. Adjust the sleeve, smile, move forward. No one ever looked closely enough to notice, and that was exactly how I needed things to remain. Aurelia existed in a world I could observe but never truly enter. The walls were dressed in warm mahogany panels, an amber chandelier light pooled across white linen tablecloths like melted gold. The guests who came here didn't glance at the waitstaff any more than they glanced at the furniture. We were part of the scenery, functional, silent, forgettable. For someone like me, that invisibility wasn't humiliating. It was protection. I'd started here 3 years ago, 2 weeks after leaving a situation I still couldn't bring myself to name out loud. The manager, Mrs. Caldwell, had taken one look at me. Thin, hollow-eyed, clutching a resume I'd typed at the public library, and hired me without ceremony. She wasn't a warm woman, but she was practical. I worked hard. I never called in sick. I never complained. And I never, under any circumstances, wore short sleeves. Lily. My coworker Dana appeared at my elbow, balancing a tray with the effortless grace she'd spent years developing. Table 9 just arrived. Full party. Mr. Chen's reservation, but apparently someone else is hosting tonight. She lowered her voice. Private security outside, 2 black vehicles. Mrs. Caldwell already told Chef to prepare the premium tasting menu without being asked. I followed Dana's gaze across the room. Table 9 was our largest private corner booth, partially screened from the rest of the floor by a frosted glass partition. I could make out movement, the shift of dark fabric, the murmur of male voices speaking in measured, unhurried tones. "Who is it?" I asked, though something in my chest had already begun to feel like standing at the edge of a very tall building. Dana shook her head. "No idea, but Mrs. Caldwell assigned you as lead server." I didn't have time to wonder why. A hand signal from across the room told me the table was ready to be approached, and I straightened my posture, checked that my sleeves sat exactly where they needed to sit, and walked toward the booth with my notepad in hand. There were 4 of them. 2 men positioned on the outer seats with the particular stillness of people trained to watch doorways. Broad-shouldered, expressionless, wearing dark suits that fit too precisely to be accidental. A 3rd man, older, with silver threading through his temples, who was already engaged in quiet conversation with someone across from him. And then the 4th. He sat at the innermost corner of the booth, which placed him with his back to the wall and a clear sightline to every entrance, a position I would later understand was never accidental. My first impression was fragments, the way your mind sometimes protects you by refusing to process something all at once. A black suit so precisely tailored it seemed architectural. A white shirt collar open at the throat, revealing the edge of ink that climbed his neck in dark, intricate patterns. Not the careless kind, but something that looked almost like a map, drawn in a language I didn't know. Dark hair swept back from a face that was younger than I expected, sharp-featured and composed with a quietness that felt more deliberate than the loudest voice in any room. He wasn't speaking. He was simply present, in the way that certain things are, like a storm front before it arrives, or the moment before music begins. I realized I had stopped walking. I forced myself forward and reached the edge of the table. "Good evening. My name is Lily, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start by bringing some still or sparkling water to the table?" 3 of the 4 men responded in various ways. The silver-haired man nodded. One of the outer guards gave a brief hand signal that I interpreted as still water. The other didn't move at all. The man at the corner said nothing. But his eyes shifted, slowly, without urgency, and found me. dark eyes. Not unkind, but measuring in a way that felt like being read rather than simply seen. He held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then looked back at the document one of his associates had placed on the table. And it was somehow worse that he looked away, because it meant I had registered as something worth noting and then filed away, all in the span of a breath. I returned to the service station on legs that felt less reliable than usual. "Table 9 water," I told Dana, and she looked at my face and wisely didn't say anything. The next hour passed in the rhythm of service. Water, bread, the first course, careful attention to which glass needed refilling, which plate needed clearing. The men at table 9 spoke little in my presence, which was standard for guests with security. I learned to read a room's temperature the way you learn any language, through repetition, pattern, consequence. These men were careful. The silver-haired one did most of the talking during courses. The 2 guards ate efficiently and kept their eyes moving. The man at the corner, whom I heard addressed once in a low exchange as Mr. Zhang, ate methodically, unhurried, occasionally studying whatever document had been placed before him, occasionally studying the room. He never appeared to study me again. And yet I was aware of him with the particular awareness you develop when something dangerous is nearby. Not fear, exactly, but a heightened attention, the way your body knows to pay careful attention before your mind catches up. It was during the 3rd course that it happened. I was reaching across the table to remove an empty bread plate when the sleeve of my white uniform shirt caught on the edge of a water glass. The glass didn't fall. I steadied it instantly with my other hand. But the fabric pulled, and for 2 full seconds, before I could correct it, the cuff rode up past my wrist. I fixed it immediately, smoothly, the way I'd practiced fixing it for 3 years, in a motion that was designed to look like nothing at all. But when I looked up, the man at the corner, Mr. Yang, was no longer reading his document. He was looking at my arm, not at my face, not at the recovered glass, at the precise place where my sleeve had been, for those 2 seconds, displaced. His expression didn't change. That was the thing that stopped the air in my lungs completely. Not horror, not pity, not the uncomfortable shift that people usually made when they accidentally glimpsed something they weren't supposed to see. His face remained exactly as it had been, composed, attentive, still. But his eyes had gone very quiet in a way that felt nothing like indifference. I stepped back from the table, tucked my notepad under my arm, and said, with a steadiness I constructed from pure will, "I'll bring the next course right out." I made it to the kitchen before my hands started to shake. I stood at the prep counter and breathed through it the way I'd learned to breathe through things, slowly, deliberately, without letting the feeling have a name. It was nothing. He had seen nothing. Even if he had seen something, it meant nothing to a man like that. Powerful men in expensive suits didn't concern themselves with the private histories of the women who served them dinner. I straightened my sleeve one final time, pressed my palms flat against the cool stainless steel of the counter, and went back out. He was gone. The entire table was gone. Coats retrieved, documents vanished, chairs empty, and precisely repositioned as though the group had never existed. A folded piece of paper sat on the white linen where Mr. Zhang's water glass had been. Beside it, a gratuity that made Dana's eyes go wide when she reached the table before me. I picked up the folded paper instead. Inside, in clean, spare handwriting that looked like someone who had been taught precision from childhood, were 4 words. "You don't have to. Nothing else. No name. No number. No explanation." I read it 3 times, standing there in the amber light of Aurelia, while the kitchen noise pressed in from behind me, and the empty booth seemed to hold a shape that wasn't quite gone yet. I didn't know what it meant. I told myself I didn't know what it meant. But my hands had stopped shaking, and that frightened me more than anything else that had happened all evening. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the narrow bed in my apartment, a studio in the Bronx that I'd chosen specifically because it asked no questions and required very little of me, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that had always looked, depending on my mood, like either a bird in flight or a closed fist. That night it looked like neither. My mind kept returning to the booth at table 9, to the precise moment the fabric shifted, to 4 words written in handwriting that belonged to someone who understood the weight of what he was saying. You don't have to. Don't have to what? Hide? Pretend? Exist in the particular way I had constructed for myself over 3 years. Sleeves down, smile measured, presence minimized to the point of near disappearance. I folded the note and put it in the drawer of my nightstand, beneath my spare uniform and the small envelope of cash I kept for emergencies. Then I lay back down and watched the ceiling and told myself that a stranger's 4 words meant nothing, because strangers didn't know enough about you to mean anything at all. I almost believed it by morning. The following week passed quietly. Aurelia's reservation calendar filled with the usual rotation of corporate dinners and private celebrations, and I moved through my shifts with the practiced efficiency that had made me Mrs. Caldwell's most reliable server. I didn't think about Mr. Jang. I thought about him approximately 40 times a day, which I decided was not the same thing. It was Dana who mentioned him first. "The Jang party is booked again," she said on Thursday morning, straightening her apron at the staff mirror near the kitchen entrance. "Saturday evening. Private reservation, same table." She glanced at me in the reflection. "Mrs. Caldwell already asked for you as lead again." I kept my expression neutral. "Did she say why?" "She said the gratuity they left last week was the largest single-table tip in Aurelia's history, and that continuity of service was important for high-value guests." Dana raised an eyebrow. "Also, I think she just noticed you didn't drop anything or visibly panic, which apparently sets a high bar around here." I managed a small laugh and went to check the linen inventory, which was not a task that needed checking, but gave me somewhere to put my hands. Saturday arrived with the particular inevitability of things you've been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I dressed in my uniform with more care than usual, then felt foolish about it, then spent 10 minutes adjusting my cuffs until the fabric sat exactly right, not too tight, not likely to shift. The small ritual of it steadied me. I was good at small rituals. The young party arrived at 8 o'clock. Same configuration as before. The 2 guards, the silver-haired associate, and Gunwoo Jang at the corner of the booth with his back against the wall. He wore charcoal tonight rather than black. A difference subtle enough that I noticed it only because I was paying the kind of attention I had specifically resolved not to pay. The ink at his throat was partially visible again above the open collar, dark patterns climbing toward his jaw, elaborate and deliberate, like armor worn on the outside of the skin. I approached the table and recited the opening pleasantries with the ease of 3 years of practice. Water preferences. Tonight's menu. The chef's seasonal additions. This time, when my eyes reached the corner of the booth, Gunwoo Jang was already watching me. Not the measuring glance of the first evening. This was something more settled. The look of a person who had already decided something and was simply confirming it. "Lily," he said. My name, in his voice, with no inflection that I could identify as anything other than acknowledgement, and yet something about hearing it, quietly, precisely, as though he had been saving it somewhere and had just decided to put it down on the table between us, made the back of my neck go warm. "Mr. Jang," I replied. "Welcome back to Aurelia." "Sit down," he said. The silver-haired associate looked up from his menu. The 2 guards didn't move, but their quality of stillness changed, became somehow more attentive. The entire booth recalibrated around those 2 words, and I understood in that moment, with absolute clarity, that this was a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed, because the alternative had never been something anyone wanted to discover. "I'm afraid that's not something I'm able to do during service," I said, and I was proud of how level my voice came out. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement that a response had been given that he hadn't entirely expected. He looked at his associate and said something brief in Korean. The older man nodded and rose from the booth, and so did both guards. And within 30 seconds I was standing at table 9 with Gunwoo Jung and approximately 4 feet of empty space between us and the knowledge that the rest of the dining room was still full of people who could see me, which should have been more comforting than it was. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "for the note." "You don't," I said. "I'm a waitress. You were a guest. Whatever you intended by it." "I intended exactly what it said." His voice was even, not cold, but containing a quality of precision that made careless words feel impossible in his vicinity. "I saw something I wasn't meant to see, and I wanted you to know that it changed nothing about how I see you, and that whatever situation produces that kind of evidence is one you should not be in alone." The dining room continued around us. Silverware clinked. Someone across the floor laughed at a quiet joke, and I stood at the edge of that booth and felt the strange, terrifying sensation of being seen. Not glanced at, not processed as part of the scenery, but actually seen, by someone who had no right to see me, and somehow had anyway. "I'm not in any situation," I said carefully. "Not anymore." He studied me for a moment. "Good," he said, and the word landed with a finality that suggested he had noted the anymore and filed it away with the same precision he seemed to apply to everything. "I'll send my team back in," he said then, and reached for the menu, which was clearly a dismissal, except that before I could step back, he added without looking up, "I'd like the same table, every Saturday." It wasn't a question. I thought about saying that Table 9's availability depended on the reservation calendar, which was technically true. I thought about reminding him that I was the waitstaff, not the booking manager. I thought about the note in my nightstand drawer and the 4 words that had kept me awake for 7 nights. "I'll let Mrs. Caldwell know your preference," I said instead. He looked up then, briefly. "Thank you, Lily." My name again. The same careful placement. I walked back to the service station, and Dana appeared at my shoulder within seconds, eyes wide with questions she was professional enough not to ask out loud. I shook my head slightly. She handed me a water pitcher and we moved on. But 3 hours later, when the party had departed and I was clearing table 9, I found that the note from the previous week had been replaced by something else. A small card, plain white, with a phone number and 2 words beneath it. "When ready." No name. No explanation. But I understood, with the certainty of someone who had spent years learning to read what people meant beneath what they said, that it was not an offer of anything specific. It was an offer of the one thing I had not had access to in so long that I had almost forgotten it had a name. A door that opened from the inside. I put the card in my apron pocket and finished clearing the table, and I didn't let myself think about it again until I was on the subway home, the car nearly empty at that late hour, the city lights sliding past the dark windows like scattered fire. Then I took the card out and read those 2 words one more time. "When ready." I pressed it flat against my palm and looked out at the dark tunnels rushing past. I was not ready. I was quite certain I was not ready. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't entirely certain that not ready, and never were the same thing. I called the number on a Tuesday, which felt less significant than a weekend, and more honest than a weekday morning when the light was too bright and practical decisions felt easier than they actually were. It rang twice. "Lily." Not a question. He had known it would be me, or he had answered every call with that same certainty, regardless of who was on the line. I couldn't decide which possibility was more unsettling. "I'm not calling because I need anything," I said immediately, which was the most transparent sentence I had spoken in years. A brief pause. "All right." I sat on the edge of my bed, The nightstand drawer open beside me, both the original note and the card sitting there like evidence of something I hadn't named yet. You said when ready. I don't know what that means. Ready for what, exactly? To talk, he said. Only that. The simplicity of it disarmed me more than any complicated answer would have. I had braced for something to push against, and there was nothing there but a quiet room and a man who seemed entirely comfortable with silence. Okay, I said. I can do that. We met 3 days later at a small Korean restaurant in Midtown. Not Aurelia, not anywhere that carried the weight of our previous context. He arrived in a black vehicle with tinted windows, accompanied by a single guard who settled at a table near the entrance and became very interested in the menu. Gunwoo himself wore a dark coat over a simple charcoal sweater, the ink at his throat more visible than usual in the casual setting, and he looked, briefly, in the moment before he saw me, like someone in the middle of a thought he hadn't finished yet. Then he saw me, and the thought resolved into something composed and attentive. We sat across from each other at a corner table. He had requested a corner, naturally, with his back to the wall, and a server brought tea without being asked, which told me this was a place he came to regularly, a place that knew his preferences and had decided that knowing them was preferable to not knowing them. Tell me something true, he said, once the tea was poured. I wrapped my hands around the warmth of the cup. That's an unusual opening. I find that direct questions produce performed answers, he said. Something true tends to arrive on its own. I looked at him across the small table. In this light, without the amber glow of Aurelia's chandeliers, he looked younger than the authority he carried, mid-30s perhaps, with a precision to his features that might have read as coldness from a distance, but up close held something more complicated. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes that suggested sleep was not something he took for granted. I've been in New York for 3 years, I said slowly, and I haven't been to a single museum. I used to love museums. I paused. That's something true. I'm not sure it's interesting. It is, he said, without inflection that suggested he was being polite. What stopped you? Not a question. An observation left open. I turned my teacup slightly on its saucer. The same thing that stopped most things for a while. He didn't press, didn't fill the space with reassurance or redirect toward something easier. He simply waited, with the patience of a person who had learned that waiting was frequently more powerful than speaking. And I found that the silence didn't feel demanding. It felt, oddly, like room. I left a relationship, I said, that I should have left much earlier than I did. And when I finally did leave, I had to rebuild a lot of things, including the habit of going places. I looked up at him. That's as much as I want to say about it. That's enough, he said immediately. And then, the Metropolitan Museum is open late on Fridays. I blinked. I know you know, he said. I'm noting it, in case it's useful. Something shifted in my chest, a small movement, like a door not opening but becoming slightly less sealed than it had been. I looked down at my tea and reminded myself that this was a man who arrived in armored vehicles and had security personnel memorizing restaurant exits, which meant that whatever quiet he projected was constructed over something considerably less quiet, and I should not let one gentle conversation dissolve 3 years of careful distance. What do you do? I asked, because asking the direct question felt safer than sitting with the indirect one. Specifically. His eyes held mine. Import and export, he said, among other things. And the other things are not for this table, he said, and his voice didn't change temperature at all. Didn't become warning or defensive, simply stated a boundary with the ease of someone who had drawn that line so many times it required no effort. But I'll tell you this. I don't involve people who don't choose to be involved, and I don't pretend to be something I'm not. That's a careful answer. It's an honest one. We stayed for nearly 2 hours, He asked about the museums I'd loved. I told him about a Hopper exhibition I'd seen in Chicago years ago. The way those paintings made loneliness look architectural, structured, and almost beautiful. He listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. When I asked about the ink on his neck, carefully, framing it as curiosity rather than scrutiny, he turned his chin slightly to give me a clearer view and explained that each section corresponded to someone he had lost. Not decoration, documentation. I thought about that for a long time without saying anything. Walking out onto the Midtown sidewalk afterward, in the cold November air that smelled of exhaust and roasting nuts from a nearby cart, I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could precisely measure. Present. Not managing the moment from behind glass, not calculating how to minimize my visibility, but simply standing on a sidewalk in the cold with the city moving around me. His guard had materialized at a respectful distance. The black vehicle idled at the curb. "Lily." Gunwoo stopped beside me, and I noticed that he had positioned himself between me and the street, without appearing to have made a decision about it. It was simply where he stood, blocking the wind and the traffic noise and anything else the street might produce. "The Metropolitan, next Friday." "Are you asking or noting again?" "Asking," he said, and the single-word correction felt significant enough that I filed it away somewhere careful. "I'll think about it," I said. He nodded once and got into the vehicle. I took the subway home and sat with my coat still buttoned in my apartment for a full 20 minutes before I remembered to take it off, because I was thinking about the way he had stood between me and the street without being asked, and how 3 years ago I would have found that suffocating, and how tonight it had felt, for one unguarded moment, like something else entirely. The Friday museum visit became 2, then 4. Then a standing arrangement that neither of us formalized because formalizing it would have required discussing what it was. And we were both, I was learning, people who understood that some things hold their shape better when left unnamed. But things were shifting. I felt it in the way Gunwoo's attention had a particular gravity to it. Not intrusive, but total. If I mentioned offhand that the walk from the subway to Aurelia was unpleasant on dark evenings, I would arrive the following week to find a car waiting 2 blocks from my apartment with a driver who asked no questions and delivered me to the restaurant door without commentary. When I told him once that I'd had a difficult shift, a guest who had spoken to me with a particular contempt that I was accustomed to absorbing, he went very still in a way I was learning to recognize. And the following week that specific guest's reservation had quietly been declined by Aurelia's booking system. "Gunwoo," I said one evening, over dinner at the Korean restaurant that had become ours by accumulated habit. "You can't manage the world around me." "I'm not managing the world," he said. "I'm managing what I can reach. That's the same thing, in your case." Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, not quite acknowledgement, somewhere between the two. "You're not afraid of me," he said, and it came out sounding less like an observation and more like something he was still processing. "Should I be?" He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to everything. "Most people are." "I know," I said. "I've watched your staff. I've watched how people move around you in a room. I'm not unaware of what you are." I met his eyes. "But you've never given me a reason to be afraid of you specifically. Those are different things." He looked at me for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "They are." It was 3 days after that conversation that I arrived at Aurelia for my Saturday shift and found Dana at the service entrance with an expression I had never seen on her face, somewhere between confusion and alarm. "There's a woman at the bar," Dana said. "She's been asking for you by name for 40 minutes. She says she knows you from before. Lily..." Dana caught my arm lightly as I moved past her. "She looks like she came to deliver something, and not in a good way." I looked through the small window in the service door toward the bar, and the floor shifted slightly beneath me. Standing at the far end of Aurelia's polished mahogany bar, in a coat that didn't quite fit the establishment's standards, and with an expression that mixed guilt and calculation in a ratio I recognized from years of reading people, was my older sister, Renee. I hadn't spoken to Renee in 3 years. Not since the night I left. Not since I'd learned that she had known, for months, and said nothing. My hand found the doorframe. Behind me, Dana was asking something I couldn't hear, and the kitchen noise pressed in from the corridor, and somewhere on the other side of the city, Gunwoo Jang was probably sitting in his own version of a corner, with his back to the wall and a clear view of every exit. I straightened my sleeves. I lifted my chin. And I walked through the door. Renee looked smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the guilt written across her features. Not the careful way she had positioned herself at the end of the bar where she could watch the entrance. Not the coat that was slightly too thin for November. She had always occupied space with a particular confidence, the older sister who knew the answers before the questions were finished, who moved through rooms like she had been there before. But the woman on that bar stool looked compressed, as though something had been pressing down on her for a long time. She saw me coming and straightened. Her hands, wrapped around a glass of water she hadn't touched, tightened almost imperceptibly. Lily. Her voice was careful, rehearsed. "You need to leave," I said quietly, stopping far enough back from the bar that we were not having a private conversation, just two people speaking in the middle of a restaurant, which meant I had witnesses and she had limits. 3 years had taught me to think like that. Whatever you came here to say, this is not the place. "I've been trying to reach you for 6 months," she said. "You changed your number. You moved. I had to hire someone just to find out where you worked." The words landed with a specific weight. She'd hired someone to find me. The casual admission of it, as though the violation of my careful privacy was simply a logistical problem she'd solved, told me that Renee had not, in the time since I'd last seen her, fully understood what she'd been part of. "Then you wasted your money," I said, "because I changed those things deliberately." Her jaw tightened. "He's looking for you." The bar noise continued around us, the soft clink of glasses, the murmur of early evening guests, the distant rhythm of the kitchen. My body processed Renee's words before my mind caught up, a cold alertness spreading from my sternum outward. "He's been asking around," she continued, and now her voice had dropped, acquired the hushed urgency of someone delivering information they believed was a gift. "Marcus, he's been... Lily, he told people you took things when you left. Money, things that belonged to him. He's been saying it to anyone who'll listen, and there are people listening. People who..." "Stop." My voice came out level. I was proud of that. "I took nothing when I left except what was mine, and we both know that." "I know that," she said, and the words cracked slightly at the edges, and I saw the guilt move through her face like weather. "I know. But he's not, Lily. He's not stable. And he has people around him now who do things for him. And I came here because I'm scared for you. Regardless of what happened between us, I'm still your..." "You knew," I said, simply, without heat, because heat was something I had burned through entirely in the first year, and what remained was something cooler and more permanent. "For 7 months you knew. And you told me I was overreacting. You told me I was too sensitive. You told me that he loved me, and that love was complicated, and that I should try harder." I held her gaze. "You knew what was under my sleeves, Renee. You saw it once, at Mom's birthday. And you looked away, and you never asked." The silence between us was the loudest thing in the room. Her eyes filled, and I watched it happen without the softening I might have expected from myself, because I had grieved this loss already, had grieved it in the particular sleepless way you grieve things that happen long before they end. "I'm sorry," she said, and I believed her. That was the complicated part. I believed the remorse was genuine, and it changed nothing about the shape of what had happened, and both of those things were true simultaneously. "You need to go," I said again. "If Marcus is asking questions, The last thing I need is for anyone to be able to connect you coming here with where I work. Go home, Renee. Don't hire anyone else to find me." I left her at the bar and walked back through the service door and stood in the corridor for exactly 90 seconds with my hands pressed flat against the cool wall, breathing the way I had learned to breathe through things. Then I picked up my tray and went back to work. I didn't tell Gunwoo that night, or the next day. I told myself this was because it wasn't his problem, that I had managed things alone for 3 years and was fully capable of continuing to do so, that whatever was developing between us didn't entitle him to the full architecture of my history, that I was protecting my own privacy, and that was a reasonable thing. I was also aware, in the quieter part of my mind, that I was afraid of what he would do with the information, not afraid of him. Afraid of the specific, focused way he responded to things that threatened what he had decided was under his protection. He found out on a Thursday. I didn't know how. I would learn later that Aurelia had security cameras in the bar area, and that footage from those cameras had a way of reaching people with the right resources and the right motivation to request it. What I knew was that I arrived at the Korean restaurant for our standing dinner, and Gunwoo was already seated, and something in the quality of his stillness was different from usual. Denser, like weather that had decided its direction. He waited until the tea was poured. "Tell me about Marcus," he said. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. I set down my cup, looked at him across the table. His face was composed, as it always was, but his eyes held something I hadn't seen there before, something controlled, but not comfortable. Not anger, exactly, because anger was too loud for what I was seeing. It was the thing that lived beneath anger in people who had learned not to let it surface without purpose. "You had someone pull the bar footage," I said. "I had someone confirm that a woman matching your description of your sister entered Aurelia's bar and remained for 40 minutes. And then I asked you," he said. "I'm asking you now." The distinction. That he was asking, that he had waited to ask rather than acting on whatever he already knew, was one I registered and held on to. So I told him. Not everything, not all at once, but the essential shape of it. 3 years ago. A relationship that had started ordinary and become something that left marks. A departure that had cost me everything I'd had at the time, and given me everything I had now in exchange. And a man named Marcus who had apparently decided that 3 years of silence wasn't enough. Gunwoo listened without interrupting. This was something I had come to rely on, the way he received information without filling the space around it immediately with his own response, the way he let things settle before he addressed them. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's been telling people you stole from him," Gunwoo said. "I know." "That's not a coincidence," he said. "That's preparation. He's building a reason." His eyes found mine. "A reason to come looking, that sounds legitimate." The cold spread further. I hadn't thought of it that way, had heard Renee's warning as the anxious report of someone carrying guilt, not as intelligence that had a specific tactical implication. "You think he's going to try to find me?" "I think," Gunwoo said carefully, "that someone has already helped him find you, and that he is building a story that explains why approaching you publicly would be reasonable." He paused. "Your sister said she hired someone to locate you. She may not be the only one who hired that person." I stared at him. The restaurant continued around us, a family at the next table celebrating something, a couple near the window sharing a dish, and I sat in the middle of the ordinary warmth of it and felt the walls of the 3 years I had so carefully constructed developing something I could only describe as cracks. "Lily." Gunwoo's voice was quiet, but it had a quality of ground to it, the kind of firmness that isn't aggressive but simply refuses to move. "I need you to hear me clearly. I am not going to let anything happen to you. That is not a request or a negotiation. It's simply what is." "You can't promise that," I said. "I can promise considerably more than most people," he said, and the directness of it. No performance, No inflation. Just a man who understood exactly what he was capable of and was extending that capability without drama. Landed somewhere in my chest and lodged there. "I don't want anything done to Marcus," I said quickly. "I need you to understand that. I don't want—" "I understand," he said. "I'm not interested in Marcus. I'm interested in making sure he has no path to you. Those are different things." I looked at him for a long moment. Across the table, in this ordinary restaurant with its warm light and its paper menu holders and its server who had just appeared with a dish neither of us had ordered because she'd learned what Gunwoo preferred on cold evenings, he looked back at me with the steady attention of someone who had made a decision he wasn't planning to revisit. "Okay," I said finally. Something shifted in his expression. Small, but I caught it. Relief, perhaps, wrapped in composure. As though my okay had been more important than he had allowed himself to show until I gave it. We finished dinner. He walked me to the car he insisted on providing, and I let him, and the city moved past the tinted windows on the way home, and I thought about walls, and what it meant when you couldn't tell anymore whether you'd built them to keep danger out, or to keep yourself in. When I got upstairs and sat on my bed, I noticed my phone had a message from a number I didn't recognize. "I just want to talk. That's all." M. My hands went cold. I sat there in the dark of my apartment with the phone in my hands and Marcus's message on the screen, and understood that whatever quiet I'd been living inside for 3 years had just ended, and what came next would require me to decide, once and for all, whether I was someone who hid or someone who stood. I didn't respond to the message. I sat with the phone in my hands for a long time, the screen going dark, then lighting again as I turned it over, then going dark once more. The apartment was very quiet. Outside, the city made its usual sounds, a siren somewhere distant, the compressed hiss of a bus stopping at the corner, voices from the apartment above moving through the ceiling like weather. I had learned to find comfort in those sounds over 3 years. They meant the world was continuing on its ordinary axis, indifferent and reliable, and that I was a small, anonymous part of it. That anonymity had been my safety. And Marcus had just put his hand through it as easily as pushing through a paper wall. I took a screenshot of the message, texted it to Gunwoo without explanation, and turned off my phone. Then I lay back on the bed with my coat still on, and stared at the ceiling and made myself breathe slowly until the cold in my hands moved up to something more manageable. My phone was back on by morning. I was not someone who could afford to be unreachable, practically speaking, and there were 2 messages from Gunwoo. The first, sent 11 minutes after I'd forwarded the screenshot. "I have it. Don't respond to him." The second, sent an hour later. "Are you all right?" Not a question mark. The same way he'd said my name the first time. A statement shaped like a question, leaving the answer entirely to me. "Yes," I wrote back. "I think so." His reply was immediate. "I'll come by at 7. He arrived exactly at 7, which I was learning was how Gunwoo operated. Precisely. Without the theatrical lateness that some powerful men use to remind you of the distance between your time and theirs. He came alone, or nearly. His driver waited downstairs, but no additional security, which I understood was a concession of some kind, a deliberate reduction of the apparatus that usually surrounded him. I buzzed him up and opened the door, and he stood in the hallway of my building, which was narrow and smelled of other people's cooking, and had a flickering light at the far end that the building manager had been promising to fix for 8 months. Wearing a dark coat and carrying 2 containers of food from the Korean restaurant. And the collision of those 2 images, the man and the context, produced something in me that I didn't immediately have a word for. "You didn't have to come here," I said. "I know," he said. "May I come in?" I stepped back. He entered my studio apartment and took it in without visible reaction. The narrow bed, the single window with its view of the brick wall across the alley, the nightstand with its drawer that held 2 pieces of paper that had changed the direction of something in my life. He set the food on the small table by the window and removed his coat and draped it over the chair back with the natural ease of someone making himself at home in a careful and respectful way. We ate at that small table with the brick wall outside the window and the building sounds pressing in from all directions, and it was the most ordinary evening I had spent in 3 years, and somehow that made it the most significant. "Tell me what you know," I said, when the containers were half empty. He set down his chopsticks. "Marcus has been in contact with someone who worked for the firm your sister used to locate you. That person sold your information in 2 directions, to your sister and to someone in Marcus's circle. By the time your sister arrived at Aurelia, Marcus already had your workplace." He paused. "He also has your general neighborhood, though not your specific address. Yet." The word "yet" sat between us on the table. "What does he want?" I said. "Actually want, not what he told Renee." Gunwoo's eyes were steady. "Control," he said. "The same thing he always wanted. The theft narrative is a mechanism. It gives him moral justification in his own mind, and it gives anyone he recruits to help him a story that sounds reasonable. But what he's responding to is the fact that you left, that you are somewhere he can't see, that you built something without him." He looked at me carefully. "People like Marcus experience that as an injury, and they seek repair in only one direction. I thought about the message on my phone. I just want to talk. The practiced reasonableness of it. How many times had I heard that exact tone, low, measured, wrapped in the language of rationality, and let it convince me that my own fear was the problem. "I'm not going back," I said. "I need to say that out loud, so it's clear." "It has always been clear," Gunwoo said. "And I'm not going to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder in my own neighborhood." "No," he agreed. "You're not." I looked at him. "What did you do?" A brief pause, not evasion, but precision. The selection of the right words. "I had a conversation with certain people who have certain overlapping interests with Marcus's social environment. The story he has been building, about theft, about property, has been addressed at its source. The people who were lending it credibility have been encouraged, persuasively, to reconsider their involvement. And Marcus himself, Gunwoo said carefully, has received a communication that made the costs of further pursuit, of any kind, very clear. Not a threat. A statement of consequences that already exist, presented as information." His eyes met mine. "He will not contact you again." I sat with that, tested the weight of it. Part of me wanted to ask for more details, to understand exactly what persuasively meant in Gunwoo's vocabulary, to map the full shape of what had been done. But I also understood that there was a line I had always maintained. I had asked for no violence, and Gunwoo had understood that, and I trusted the quality of his understanding in a way that was no longer provisional. "He'll just stop," I said. "Yes." "Because you asked him to." Something moved at the corner of Gunwoo's mouth. I have a way of asking that tends to produce lasting results. I looked down at my hands on the table. Both of them, palms up, visible. "I've been hiding for 3 years, I said. "In a job where no one looks at me. In a neighborhood where no one knows my name. In clothes that..." I stopped, breathed. I built this whole life around being invisible. And I think I started to believe the invisibility was the life. "It wasn't," Gunwoo said simply. "No." I turned my hands over. "I know that now." We stayed at that table for another hour, and at some point the conversation moved away from Marcus entirely, to the Hopper exhibition I'd finally returned to, at the Metropolitan on a recent Friday, standing in front of Nighthawks for 20 minutes while Gunwoo stood beside me and said nothing, and I cried a little, quietly, in a way that felt less like sadness and more like something that had needed to leave for a long time, finally finding a door. When he stood to go, he lifted his coat from the chair back and paused. "Lily," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that whatever you answer, nothing changes between us." I waited. "I would like you to have a choice," he said, "about the life you build from here. I can make sure Marcus never reaches you, and then you decide what everything else looks like. Aurelia, this apartment, the museums on Fridays, all of it on your own terms." He held my gaze. "Or, if you want, you build it with someone who already knows what's under the sleeves and isn't going anywhere." The room was very quiet. Outside, the city continued its indifferent, reliable sounds. The radiator clicked. Somewhere above us, a child laughed at something, bright and uncomplicated, and the sound came through the ceiling like a small piece of ordinary grace. I thought about 3 years of careful invisibility. I thought about a note that said "you don't have to," and a card that said "when ready," and a man who stood between me and the street without being asked and listened to me talk about Edward Hopper paintings without once checking his phone. I thought about what it felt like to be seen. "I'm not the same person I was when I came to New York," I said. "I know," he said. "I met the person you are now." I crossed the small space of my studio apartment and did something I had not done in 3 years. I reached out first. Not dramatically, not with the weight of everything it carried, just my hand finding his. His fingers closed around mine with a steadiness that asked nothing and offered everything. "Stay," I said. "For now. Just tonight, in the chair. I just don't want to be alone in this apartment with all of this quiet yet." He looked at me for a moment, and what moved across his face was something I didn't need to name to understand. He set his coat back down on the chair. "All right," he said. I made tea. He sat by the window, and at some point I fell asleep on the narrow bed, with the lamp still on, and the city still speaking its language outside. And when I woke in the early gray morning, he was still there, upright in the chair, awake, watching the window with the particular attention of a man who took the safety of a room seriously. He looked over when I stirred. "Good morning," I said, and my voice came out soft and unguarded, the way voices do before you remember to construct them. "Good morning," he said. Months passed in the way that time passes when you've stopped measuring it by what you're surviving. I returned to the Metropolitan. Not just Fridays, but whenever I wanted, sometimes alone, sometimes not. I changed nothing about Aurelia immediately, because I liked the work, and Mrs. Caldwell, I had decided, was a woman I respected. But I started wearing short sleeves on warmer days, first at home, then outside. And the city received this information with the total indifference of a city that had always had more important things to pay attention to. Renee called, 3 months after the bar. I let it go to voicemail twice, then called her back on a Sunday afternoon, sitting at the small table by the window with the brick wall outside, and a cup of tea going cold beside me. The conversation was not easy, and it was not resolved in a single call, and I did not pretend that the hurt had a simple address. But I answered. That was the beginning. Marcus did not contact me again. Gunwoo and I did not make announcements or declarations. We had dinner at the Korean restaurant on Thursdays. We walked through museum galleries on Fridays. On Sunday mornings, occasionally, he arrived at my door with food and the easy silence of someone who had decided that being near me was reason enough. And I opened the door wider, every time, a little more naturally than the last. One Thursday evening in April, the cherry trees along the park path were just beginning to open. That particular shade of pink that only lasts a few days before it becomes something else. And we were walking back toward the car when I stopped and turned my face up toward the branches. I used to think I'd have to leave New York, I said. Start over somewhere else. That this city had become something I'd always associate with hiding. Gunwoo stopped beside me. The blossoms moved in a small wind. "And now?" he said. I looked at the trees and the last light coming through them, and the ordinary, unbeautiful, completely irreplaceable city moving around us. "Now it's just where I live," I said, "where things happened that made me who I am." I turned to look at him. "That's enough." He looked back at me with the expression I had come to know best, the one that wasn't performed or constructed, that lived beneath the composure he wore everywhere else, quiet and certain and entirely present. "Yes," he said, "it is." The trees let go of a few blossoms in the wind, and they crossed the path between us and disappeared, and the city carried on, and I stood in the middle of it with my sleeves rolled up and my face toward the open air, and I was, at last, simply here, not hiding, not surviving. Here,